My Friend Flicka by Mary O'Hara. Chapter 7. Even before he opened his eyes next morning, Ken knew that something was wrong, and he pushed away the moment of complete awakening. He lay facing the window and saw that the pines on the hill were quiet. No wind today. Then he remembered. He had stampeded the mares. He had a feeling that it was late. For some time he had been half hearing all the early morning noises. Gus opening the kitchen door. The only reason his steps across the kitchen floor and the shaking down of the ashes and the making of the fire didn't wake everyone was because they were so used to it. There had been steps going down too, and his mother's voice saying, "Time to get up, boys." He slipped out of bed and went to the window, hitching up his pajamas. Howard was on the terrace right underneath, and Ken could see the top of his head black and smooth, with the part exactly in the centre. He had on blue jeans and a clean chambray shirt and a red bandana. Howard looked up. "Hi." Ken stared at him without answering. Howard's black eyebrows and his thin mouth were straight lines across his face. He was smiling a little, but his eyes were watching craftily. "Mad at me, aren't you?" "Tattletale. I didn't tell on you. You're a liar. All I did was ask if cigarette tossed you and if you found the blanket. You started it. You knew I'd get in the neck. That's not lying. You're always getting me in trouble. You want to. Say, let's make up, Ken. We could go down to the swimming pool. It's gonna be hot." Ken glowered. "We could start on the colts." "What colts?" "Our summer colts. Dad left 4 of them in the calf pasture yesterday. We got a halter break them, like we did last year." "I get first choice," he said. "Do you choose one and then I choose one and then you and then I? Or do you choose both yours first?" "Well," he said, "I could choose both first." "I bet you're lying. Tell you what, Ken, if you'll make up, I'll choose just one and let you choose next." Their father's voice came loudly. "Didn't I tell you to watch that sprinkler, Howard?" Howard hastily changed the sprinkler. McLaughlin was coming from the tool house. He had let out the dogs, and they were jumping around him frantic with joy, as if they were afraid, every night, there would never be another letting out or another morning. McLaughlin had a shovel in his hand and went about the green, cleaning it of the manure the horses had left and shouting to Howard about taking an interest in the grass that had been so hard to start and was still hard to keep green. The red Rhode Island hen that had stolen a nest followed him, clucking and picking at the manure spots, and the hatch of cheeping yellow chicks swarmed around her, tiny feet twinkling at her call and wing fluffs beating the air. Ken faded back into the room and hastily began to dress. The smell of coffee filled the house. Howard watched his sprinkler, moving it, little by little, down the terrace and planned his day. Ken would be all right now, he thought. It was never hard to manage. They might have fun in the swimming pool, or go shooting. "Breakfast," sang out Nell's voice. She ran out onto the terrace. She had on a green dress with a zipper all the way down the front and a sash across the back. She clapped her hands and yelled for them to come, and Rob dropped his shovel and ran at her, and Ken stopped tying his necktie to watch. His mouth was open, and there was a smile on his face, because it was always fun when his father and mother started playing. She dodged and ran around the fountain, and her husband chased her and reached out a hand and caught her sash and undid it. And she screamed and ran for the steps, and both dogs ran in between them, barking, and almost tripped him up. They'd gone in. Ken hurried to finish, but he hated to go down. He felt so out of things. On the way downstairs, he stopped before the picture of the duck. It was a big black duck with white breast and legs and white bars on his wings. He was fierce and handsome, standing on his rock, just about to launch himself into the waves of the grey, choppy lake. There was such a reaching in his eager beak and one lifted foot, and the forward tilt of his body. Ken felt as if it dragged him in too. In another second he would feel the icy sting and shock of the water, the bitter cold, sharp, unpricked waves, and the greyness of the misty air hanging over it, full of fear and loneliness. His skin went gooseflesh. At the breakfast table, his father was waiting to hear Ken clatter the rest of the way downstairs. "I bet he's looking at the duck," said Howard. "What duck?" "On the landing. He looks at it for an hour sometimes." "Howard," reproved Nell, "he never looks at it for an hour." "Well, a long time. Seems like an hour. What duck on the landing?" "My Order 1 print," explained Nell quickly. "The one that hangs under the clock. Ken likes to look at it." "Ken!" roared his father, and hastily Ken's sturdy shoes clattered the rest of the way down the stairs, and he came into the kitchen, his hair meticulously parted and slicked down, and his face sullen. "What did you stop on the landing for?" Ken opened his napkin and looked down, embarrassed. "I was looking at the duck." "The duck? Out the window?" "The duck in the picture there." There was a little amused glint in Nell's eyes as she helped Ken to oatmeal. "Didn't you know we were at breakfast?" I didn't think," finished his father for him. Ken didn't look up or make any reply. He had known it would be like this. He poured cream on his oatmeal and reached for the brown sugar. "Ken," said his father, "I'm going to take back an order I gave you yesterday. I'm going to remit your hour of study." Ken looked at his father in astonishment, his mouth opening in relief and pleasure. "I've got other plans for you this summer," McLaughlin continued pompously, and Nell tucked her face down to hide her smile. How often had she heard Rob order a balky horse to whoa, or seen him spur and lash a runaway. "And," continued Rob blandly, "I'm going to give you a colt." Ken shot out of his chair. Spoon and dishes went clattering. A spring colt, Dad? Or a yearling?" McLaughlin was taken aback, but Nell dropped her eyes again. If Ken got a yearling colt, he'd be even up with Howard. "A yearling colt, your father means, Kenny," she said smoothly. "Sit down and eat your breakfast. Look what you've done to your porridge." Ken gathered up the china and silver he had scattered, replaced them and sat down again. Colour had rushed to his face. "I'll give it to you a week from today," said his father. "Between now and then you can look over them and make your choice." "I can have any yearling colt on the ranch that I want?" asked Ken. His father nodded calmly, pushed his chair back and took out his pipe. Speechless, Ken turned to look at Howard, and the two boys eyed each other. Even up at last. "Does it have to be a yearling colt, Dad?" asked Howard. "Could it be a spring colt, if you'd rather have a spring colt?" "It could be anything foaled on the ranch since a year ago," said McLaughlin. "There are 18 yearlings. So far, 13 or 14 new colts, a few to come yet." "Will you take a yearling or a spring colt, Ken?" asked Howard. In answer, Ken turned upon Howard an exaggerated, pitying sneer, copied from the movies and mastered only after much practice. But his father asked the same thing. "Yearling or spring colt, Ken?" Ken answered, "A yearling. Horse or filly?" This stopped him. His eyes lost focus as mental images crowded. Rocket was a mare, but there was Banner, and the albino, Mustang Hero. There emerged from the confusion a definite sense of the superiority of the male. "I'll take a horse colt." His voice was final and authoritative. An imperceptible glance passed between Nell and her husband. McLaughlin said, "That narrows it down. Let's see. How many horse colts were foaled last year?" 10 fillies and 8 horse colts, said Howard. "You've got 8 horse colts to choose from, Ken." Things were moving very fast for Ken, horses crowding him. "Which were they?" said Nell. "I've got them all down in the stud book. I left it up at the stables the other day, in the tack room." Ken, run up and get it, and we'll look over the list. I'll go too, said Howard, sliding out of his chair, and both boys rushed out of the door. Ken tore ahead. A colt, his own! His mind was full of images. A little foal just born, almost knocked down by its mother's tongue licking it, banner rearing, his great forefeet beating the air, his big light belly, his fierce face and arching neck. A little yearling running, a black, a chestnut, his colt was all of them. He dropped his head back and yelled. He pranced and galloped. Howard caught up with him and said, "You crazy!" My colt, sang Ken. He ran in a circle, pacing, racking. He stuck his elbows out and said, "Whoa there, hi!" He tossed his head and shook his mane. "You goofy," exclaimed Howard, watching him. Ken rushed at him with fists up. Howard fell into position and they sparred. Ken didn't care what happened to him. His arms went like flails. Howard blocked his blows easily. Ken broke out of it and went flying up to the stable. He had a sharp consciousness of change and new importance. Things had begun at last. Things could be real now. They found the stud book and ran back with it. As Nell read out the list of yearlings and the names of their dams, Ken began to feel queer. These were definite flesh and blood animals, named, described, tagged, in a book, not the colts that had kicked their heels and played and tossed their manes in his dreams. He felt the sense of loss which every dreamer feels when the dream moves up, comes close, and at last is concrete. I haven't named them all, Nell was saying. There were some I never saw. They had run off somewhere when I went up on 20 to look over and put them in the book. The bronc bunch, grunted McLaughlin, referring to the progeny of the albino. They're always missing when they're wanted. Ken and I trained 4 of these yearlings ourselves, said Howard. Every summer the 2 boys had the job of handling and halter breaking 4 of the spring colts. The colts the boys trained last summer were Doughboy and College Boy and Lassie and Firefly, said Nell, studying the book. 2 horse colts and 2 fillies. Say, Ken, said Howard eagerly, why don't you take Doughboy? He was one of yours, and when he grows up he'll be sort of twins with mine. In his name, anyway. Doughboy, Highboy, see? But Ken looked scornful. Doughboy would never have half Highboy's speed. Last summer, McLaughlin, looking over the colts, had said, he's a chunk. We'll name him Doughboy. He might turn out a heavy hunter. Look at the big legs on him. Lassie, then, suggested Howard again. If you want speed, she's fast as anything, and she's black as ink, like Highboy. I said I was going to take a horse, said Ken. Besides, Dad said Lassie'll never go over 15 hands. Remember one thing, Ken, said McLaughlin. You can't tell much about a colt when it's newborn, and not always much more when it's a yearling. Blood's the thing. The prepotency of blood. They had heard this term often. Whenever McLaughlin got talking about horses, he used it. That's the trouble with this stuff I've got from the albino. He had prepotency. That devil passed on his traits. They don't wear out. Must have had some magnificent blood strains somewhere in his ancestry. Arab, probably. Put enough Arab blood into a line and it gives prepotency to the traits you don't want as well as to those you do. Lots of Arab blood in these western Mustangs. Comes from the Arab and Barb horses the Spaniards brought over. McLaughlin got up, went to the shelf beside the spice closet, and took down one of his favourite books on the genealogy of the American horse. He turned the pages, looking for a certain passage, found it, sat down again, and began to read. The boys exchanged a glance of agonized impatience as the familiar lecture started. Suddenly, Howard jerked his head around. "Car coming," he explained. Rob stopped reading. They heard a car rattle over the cattle guard at the home pasture fence, come up the low hill behind the house in low gear, and whiz past. The boys darted to the pantry window and saw the rear of the car as it disappeared over the crest of the hill on its way to the stables. "A big, dusty, black car," announced Howard. McLaughlin closed his book. "Might be Doc," he said. "The vet?" exclaimed Nell. "What for?" "To go the 2-year-olds. Boys, run up to the stables and see if that's Doc Hicks." Ken and Howard slammed through the kitchen door and vanished. "But those 2-year-olds are still out on the range," said Nell. "I saw them just the other day." "I brought them in. They're in the 6-foot pasture." The 6-foot pasture, about a quarter of a mile square, was so named because it was fenced with barbed wire to a height of 6 feet, the highest and tightest fences McLaughlin had on the ranch. The near end of it adjoined the corrals, the far end, the country road. Nell stopped eating. "Rob, don't let the boys see the gelding." "They might as well," said Rob. "They have to know, sooner or later." "They know already, but so far they've never actually seen it. You've always had it done before they got home from school. Won't hurt 'em." The boys burst through the door. "It's Doc Hicks and his assistant." "I thought so. Run back and tell Gus to get a fire started up there and get some water boiling." "He's already up there. He's got the fire lit." They turned to dash away again. Nell called Ken back. "You haven't finished your breakfast. Drink your milk and eat every bit of that ham." A moment later Gus appeared at the door. "If we could have an old sheet for clean rags, missus." Nell brought an old sheet, clean and folded, from the linen closet. Ken gulped the last swallow of milk, wiped his mouth, said "Excuse me, please," and darted out. Gus was walking away, the sheet over his arm. "Dad's given me a colt, Gus. Any colt on the ranch up to a year old." Gus looked down at him. "You gonna train it and take care of it yourself, Ken?" "You bet." Gus made no comment, but his head tilted in a speculative manner. Rob and Nell, left alone, had a last cup of coffee together. Then Nell rose to clear the table and Rob lit his pipe. There was an odd expression on his face. Did you notice his voice when he said that? "Said what?" "I'll take a horse colt." They looked at each other and Rob gave a sudden guffaw of laughter. He went to the door, took his big hat from the hook and pulled it on, dragging it down to his eyebrows. He's never talked or looked like that in his life before. Nell suddenly laughed too. Rob added, "Now if he just picks a good one," and the door slammed behind him. Nell stood for a few moments, the laughter fading from her face. Then she went to the sink and began to draw the water. "A bloody day," she sighed. "I just hope they all get through." It was considered by many breeders that it was better and certainly safer to geld colts at the age of a year or a year and a half, but Rob wanted to retain as long as possible the young stallion's endowment of furious power. The 9 2-year-olds, clustered now at the far end of the 6-foot pasture near the county road, were well grown and fleshed, their necks thick and strongly arched. The hairs of their manes and tails stood out with a separate vigour of their own, and their hides shone so brightly that the early morning sun, blazing down, struck glints from the round haunches and bulging neck muscles. Like schoolboys, they wrestled and punched. A couple shot out of the bunch, whirled and lashed with hind feet. The others leaped and scattered. A golden sorrel dropped his head, stiffened his legs, twisted his body and began to buck. When he finished he stood looking about as if for applause, shook himself violently, then ran at another horse with head stretched out, ears laid back and teeth bared. 2 big blacks rose on their hind legs and began a make-believe fight, coiling and uncoiling inside the floating fringes of their long black hair. They struck at each other with their forefeet, then curved away only to meet and charge again. One head rose over the other to nip at the back of the neck. The other twisted out, reared higher, and counter-attacked. This shadow boxing was brought to an abrupt halt when the sound of a long, trilling whistle reached them from the direction of the corrals. Every horse faced around, pricked his ears sharply, and became motionless. It took them a little while to think it over, watching the corrals with their near miraculous eyesight, which brought the scene a quarter of a mile away, as close as if with a telescope. The whistle came again. They began to move, slowly at first with nodding heads, then faster, until the leaders broke into a canter and the rest followed. They swept down on the corral in a bunch, propped and stopped. Nervous and curious, with ears straining forward, they watched the men moving within the enclosures, as if demanding to know why they had been called. Ken, perched on the high corral fence, almost choked with excitement. "I've got one too," he exulted. "Oh, you beauties! In a year, my yearling will be a 2-year-old like you." Longing to be closer to them, he slipped down from the fence and ran to his father. "Dad, can I bring them in?" "Don't have to bring them in. Just get me a bucket of oats." Rob opened the corral gates, and when Ken brought the bucket, went through to the colts and offered it, talking to them gently, allowing each one to dip his nose in the bucket for a delicious mouthful. When he returned to the corral, they followed close, jostling him. Ken shut the gate and mounted the fence again. Doc Hicks was pulling on his clean white overalls. Doc, 6'2" and built like a Hereford steer, never wasted time. A day's work often meant 2 or 3 such jobs as this, perhaps 100 miles of Wyoming roads to cover in his big, high-powered car, piled full of boxes and satchels, instruments, serums, bottles, lariats, ropes, and halters. Old Bill Sims, lantern-jawed and sad, worked with him, never saying a word, never smiling. Bill took charge of the equipment, sterilized and laid out the instruments, swung the lariat when the colt had to be thrown, cleaned up afterwards. They worked fast. It was not yet dinner time, and the sun was almost directly overhead when Bill carried the gear to the car again and packed it in. He and Doc took their places on the front seat. The engine started, the car pulled away, the job was done. Ken watched the car coast down the hill to the cattle guard, then pick up speed on the long curving road which led out to the highway. When it disappeared around the shoulder of the hill, Ken made for the pine woods that were up behind the house and flung himself face down on the warm pine needles. Next year it would be his own colt who would be struggling on the ground with Bill sitting on his head, who would crowd into the corner when it was over and stand there motionless, shocked, taking no notice when Rob went to him with oats and pats and comforting words. Pretty tough old fellow, pretty tough. Oh, he knew all right that you couldn't have more than one stallion on a ranch. Stallions were bothersome. They were even dangerous and fought and killed each other. But, Ken pounded with the toe of his boot on the earth. He heard a match struck close by and raised his head to see his father standing there, lighting his pipe. McLaughlin sat down beside his boy, put out an arm and drew him against him. Kenny. "Oh, my colt, Dad, my colt." Rob's arm tightened. Ken pressed against it, crying bitterly. It's the end of chapter 7. Good night, sleep tight.